Erev Tov, at least here in Jerusalem. Boker Tov to those of you who are contacting us from the Western diaspora. We have people from Israel, we have people from Europe, and definitely from North America for another webinar sponsored by Chidush, Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, and J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. We are trying to provide a mix of topics, some focus on spiritual, rabbinic issues, some focus on legal issues, and the one we are offering you today with Professor Moshe Hellinger, whom I'll briefly introduce in a second, is really a mix, because the topic of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is both spiritual and legal, because back in 1992, the Knesset passed the basic law on human liberty and dignity, and another basic law, which for the first time included that phrase referring to the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And ever since then, this is a topic of tremendous interest, concern, debate, philosophical, legal, halachic, and in many other areas. And in introducing Professor Moshe Hellinger, I want to say that in addition to his formal credentials that you have seen in the invitation, he's a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University, and an activist, combining his scholarly work and his views as he will share them with you, with activism, which currently, if I understand correctly, are partially represented in his being a board member in Darkenu and a member of the advisory board of DemocratTV, and many other engagements. But I happened to listen to Professor Hellinger, whom I did not know before, in a Hebrew podcast that he recorded some time ago about the question of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And I have to say, I called him right away, because it's been a long time since I heard somebody express and refer and analyze and offer a way out of this dilemma of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state that I could agree with as much as I had with Professor Hellinger. So naturally, I was thinking about all of you as I listened, and felt that providing exposure to his approach to the question of, can Israel be both Jewish and democratic, or as he suggested we frame it, can Israel be both more Jewish and more democratic? I trust and hope that it'll come across to the English speakers in our interested and activist community as it has in the Hebrew. So the microphone and the stage is yours, Professor Hellinger, with just a couple of brief comments. One is, by all means, use the chat to pose questions. And Professor Hellinger will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have about half an hour, maybe a little more if you're patient and interested, for questions and answers. Professor Hellinger would welcome that. And that in 2 weeks, on Monday, 2 weeks from now, if all goes well, we'll have a new government in Israel next week. In a few days, we'll know what the coalition agreements that will serve as the basis of this new government are. And at that point, I think all of you, I certainly would be interested in sharing with you how the new government is going to fare, and what the new government is going to mean in terms of the clash of religion and state. It's an opening of potentially of a new chapter, new opportunities that are relevant to the topic Professor Hellinger will be presenting, but are relevant and I'm sure of interest, concern, importance to all of us. So 2 weeks from now, and the announcement will go out soon with a registration link, we'll be discussing the coalition agreements, the makeup of the new government, and what all of that means for American Jewry, for diaspora Jewry, and for the future of religion-state relations in Israel.
The events might be closed.
Professor Hellinger, the stage and the microphone is yours after 1 second in which I will mute everybody. And please unmute yourself, Professor Hellinger.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rabbi Regev. I was very happy to speak with you. We didn't know before each other, and it was very nice hearing from you. And I welcome this invitation. I hope I will have some ideas that some of you will find interesting. You don't have to agree with everything I say, but debates are also welcome. And we'll have, I hope, enough time to later on speak freely about these topics. I want to start what I don't usually do in my lectures. I want to give you a little bit my biography because it's very relevant to this issue. I was born in Tel Aviv in 1960. In a building, in our building, there were 11 families. We were the only religious family. And I had very, very good friends who weren't religious, but Tel Aviv of the 60s, 70s, I guess many of you know, was a place that many religious people lived there, and there were many synagogues, crowded synagogues. So living together, religious and seculars in Tel Aviv was different than in most places in Israel. But I learned in Haredi schools. My parents were, most of them passed away, were Holocaust survivors from Czechoslovakia. They even were married during the war, 1942. Later on, my father went to Auschwitz, came back, and they lived in Prague till 48, and then they moved to Paris and then to Israel. And I learned in Haredi schools. My father was a big Talmid Chacham in Munkac, in Czechoslovakia, and he wasn't Zionist, but everyone was Holocaust survivor. For him, Israel was important. So he always went out during Independence Day to Tel Aviv in the city hall to see, all the festivals, etc. But I learned in Haredi places, in Tel Aviv, in Yeshiva Hadash, and then in Yeshivat Hebron in Yerushalayim. Some of you maybe know about it. But the Yeshiva is one of the 2 best yeshivot in Israel. And later on in Koilel, in Mir, in Mea Shearim in Yerushalayim. But all the time, I also was interested in literature and history and other fields like my father and mother were. And so we had television from 1970. In Israel, it was only from 1968. So I was living in both worlds of religion, religious and Haredi world, Agudat Israel, and also for modern Western world. And that was very normal and natural for me. Later on, I became more religious Zionist in my 30s. I was also, I give Shurei Torah till today. I don't see myself anymore as Haredi, but a part of me is Haredi, part of me is secular, part of me is religious Zionist, and part of me is human being. So all this mixture is part of me. And then I went to I learned in Open University, and then I was a teacher for a few years and a rabbi in a school. And later on, I made my master's at Bar-Ilan University on Dostoevsky, whom I love very much. And I wanted to be an expert on Dostoevsky, and then Rabin was assassinated in 1995. 3 weeks before the assassination, I was already lecturing in the Ashkelon College. I went to a class after seeing the demonstrations near Bar-Ilan, and I was shocked from what I saw many times. And I came to the class and I said, I feel that somebody will try to assassinate Rabin. And 3 weeks later, he was assassinated. And this assassination was a crucial event for me. It changed my fields. I stopped my thinking of doing PhD on Russian literature and etc. And then I started thinking about Judaism, Judaism and democracy, because the clash, according to many people, including the assassinator, Yigal Amir, was not only because of the peace talks and agreements with PLO, but because the question was, which state are we going to more Jewish state or more liberal democratic state? And there's no option of building it together. And then I became devoted to the idea that I must try to find out whether in Jewish texts and interpretations and halachic Orthodox texts and interpretation, which are more complicated, and I am modern Orthodox for more than 30 years, you can build a bridge synthesis between Judaism and democracy. Because if you are a Reform Jew, it's much easier, or even conservative. But if you are Orthodox, it's more complicated. So that became a mission in my life. I spoke to more than 60, 70,000 people around Israel in the last 25 years, to thousands of officers in high schools. It was more important for me than my career in the academy. I gave hundreds and hundreds of lectures on Judaism and the political science and many issues regarding those topics. And I also spoke to many people from America who came to Israel, and I was invited to speak to young people and teachers, etc., about this topic. So for me, it's a life. It's something that is me. It is existential. What I'll try to do in the next 15 minutes, 20 minutes, what I'll try to do is to try to portray what I see as happening in Israel, and then I'll try to show my point of view. I wrote a book in Hebrew, which called Medinat Israel Le'an, a year ago, which is the broader of research on the question whether Israel can be both Jewish and democratic. About 500 pages work, 5 years of work. And now I'm finishing translation to English. I hope in 1 year it will be out in an academic press in America, probably in SUNY, where I published a book a few years ago. I'll start by saying something that not many people understand. According to my understanding, as somebody who learned years these issues, Israel was not meant to be a democratic state. Israel was meant to be a Jewish state. But the founders of Israel didn't see any other option for a Jewish state unless it will be a democratic state as well. The idea was to bring back the Jewish people to the homeland in Eretz Israel and to build a Jewish state. But the sort of state, the sort of government, the sort of the system of government should be only democratic. At the beginning, during Ben-Gurion's time, it wasn't a full liberal democracy. Well, it was what we call formal democracy, which is basic. You have elections, you have not all the power is in one hand, etc., etc. So it's democracy. But it took years till Israel became more liberal during Schwartz times and later on during Begin times. Begin was very important in making Israel more democratic and more liberal. Because Jabotinsky and Begin believed in a combination of liberalism and nationalism, more than the people from the labor movement. And so Israel became inside Israel, not in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza Strip, but inside Israel, in the Green Line, became more and more liberal and more democratic in many, many ways. The Supreme Court was very important in making Israel much more democratic and much more liberal in many decisions. From the beginning, when the Supreme Court wasn't activists, from just the beginning of the 50s, the Supreme Court was very important in this regard. And actually, there wasn't a question of Judaism versus democracy because nobody thought there is a problem. When you see a lot of researches on an issue or a lot of books and a lot of journalists who wrote about it, then you know that there is a problem. Like when you see many decorations when you are in the army, probably there was a big problem there. The same about Judaism and democracy. Judaism and democracy became more and more an issue during the 80s, 90s, and especially after the assassination of Rabin. And it is a key issue in Israel till today. And it's a key issue that unfortunately bring about more and more most of the youngsters in Israel and the youngsters in America. We are living in a time when it will be more and more problematic to speak about one Jewish people. Because what we see in the last 30, 40 years, especially in the last 10, 15 years, is the building of two separate nations in many regards, in Israel and in America. The vast majority of the people below 40 in America are liberal, are voting for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party itself become more leftist, progressive. Some of the people there are anti-Israelis. The majority of the young people in Israel, people below 40, turn to the right, even now in the government. Without the right people in the government, we couldn't have another government without Netanyahu. And the head of the prime minister is going to be somebody from the religious Zionists who is more right-wing than Netanyahu. And with him will be Gideon Sa'ar, who is more right-wing than Netanyahu. So the vast majority of the young people, I mean, people below 40 are not secular, are either Haredi or religious Zionists or traditionalists from Mizrahi background, Oriental background. And they are not secular even if they drive in Shabbat. So today there is not, we are not in a situation that we used to be in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that people spoke about majority of Jews in Israel who are secular and minority about 20, 25% who are religious. This is old history. Doesn't have anything to do with reality. The more important group within Israel today is what I call secular religious or religious secular. Both. There are people who are more religious than secular, like me, and there are people who are more secular than religious, but both religious and secular. And it is relevant for many people in religious Zionism that the culture is also Jewish, halachic, but also liberal Western. And many things they take from the Western world, and many heroes comes from the Western world. And the same about many people who define themselves as not religious, but they are traditionalists. And they keep a lot of, in America, what we call traditionalists will certainly be called religious. The majority of the people who are traditionalists in Israel keep more mitzvot, at least ritual mitzvot, than most of the reforms in America. The reforms in Israel are different from the reforms in America. The conservatives are different from the conservative in America. And everything we turn more to the right. The right in religious matter, I mean, keeping more mitzvot and feeling more Jewish, etc. And today, the key problem, according to my point of view, is that this gap between what's happening in the new generations in Israel and the new generations in Jewish people in America, the gap is all the time more wide. And we must do something about it. All the movements, Orthodox, Reform, everybody, conservative, everybody. It's a key issue for everybody. So this is one issue that's also Jewish and democratic, because the Americans are more liberal democratic, and the values they think higher in the Jewish tradition are more liberal values. Tikkun olam, universalistic understanding of Judaism. But in Israel, the understanding of Judaism, according to the majority of Israelis, is very particularistic. The difference between us and the Gentiles, the difference between us and the Arabs. So Judaism itself is a complex of individualistic and universalistic ideas and concepts from one hand, and collectivistic and particularistic ideas and concepts from the other. And this tension is very important in the Jewish tradition. But today, fewer and fewer people live this tension. I live this tension every minute. Because for me, being part of the world and humanistic values of human rights that basically come more and more from the Bible, creation of man according to God's image, is very, very important to me. The commands in the Torah about the ger, which is not the Jew, who you should treat him equally, 36 times in the Torah, is very, very important to me as an Orthodox Jew. But I am in a minority in Israel. I don't represent the majority of Orthodox in Israel. Still, I work hard to try to bring more people to my ideas, but it's not easy. Because of security reasons, because of other reasons, it's not easy. And in America, the trend is to be more and more universalistic. And the more universalistic you are, sometimes you lose the connection to true and deep Jewish feelings and commitments, which is a big issue in America. I know America quite well. I was in America many, many times. Most of my family lives in America. They are Orthodox, right-wing, Haredi, or religious Zionists. Live in New York, in Flatbush, and other places. I mean, in many places in America. I gave lectures in America. I know the American people and the American Jewish community very well. And I know what is happening, which is tragic. There are three issues, but again, I want to say the other thing. I really believe that what will save Israel from losing its democratic heritage is, upon all, its Jewish heritage. For many secular people and Haredi and religious Zionist people, being more democratic is being less Jewish. And being more Jewish is being less democratic. And I say clearly that as Jews who have a Jewish heritage, that it is against tyranny and for humility before God, and because of that to treat all people as equals. And it's for culture of debates, of מחלוקות, כל מחלוקת שהיא לשם שמיים, סופה להתקיים, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says. We have a 3,000 years of religious and political culture that thinks highly on debates, that doesn't want a pope, that is against unanimous thinking and uniformity. And this is very important for building liberal democratic culture in Israel. So I'm not afraid that Israel won't be a democratic inside the green line. I will speak later on about the West Bank. Inside the green line. Because we are a Jewish state. And at the same time, after saying that, as always, I am a true Jew, and my message is always complex, never simple. After saying that, of course, I know that the more religious people are, the less liberal democratic they are. usually, and vice versa. Most of the people who hold deep liberal ideas are secular in Israel, Ashkenazi seculars, left-wings, center-left. And most of the people who have a lot of anti-democratic ideas, not that they want a dictator, nobody wants a dictator in Israel, but they are for less rights for Arabs, and they want more Jewish state, and they don't have any problems with settlements, etc., etc. They are more religious, including the Haredim. The Haredim in the past weren't for settlements, but today, most of them are. They turn to the right. They don't define themselves as Zionists, but actually they are right-wing Zionists in many regards. So there is a tension here between the basic level that Jewish identity and heritage helps a lot to the Israeli democracy, and at the same time, religious Jews in Israel are many times those who are less democratic. So how can you bridge this gap? I always say to my secular left-wing friends, and I remember Uri said before in some movement that like Darkenu, in America it's called One Voice. I'm in the board of Darkenu in Israel. And I am the only one there who is center. Not right, not left, but being center there is being right. And I used to be left, and I turned to the center after the Intifada of Al-Aqsa during 2000. And what I always say is, I will say it here as well. If somebody is really worried about the future of Israel democracy and he wants to strengthen Israeli democracy, he must speak in a Jewish language. If you want to strengthen democracy and you speak in a democratic language only, there's no chance. You'll speak to the convicted, but you won't be able to speak the majority of the Israeli people, the Jewish Israeli people. The Arabs are also not democratic. They want democracy from Israel, but inside themselves, they are very anti-democratic. They are the less democratic section within Israeli society, the Israeli Arabs. They want Israel to become a state of all its citizens, a liberal democracy. That is against Zionism, but not when it comes to questions of women, of homosexuals, etc., etc. There, they are very, very anti-democratic. So if I want to be able to be relevant to people who are center-right, who are Orthodox or traditionalists, I must speak Jewish, but I must speak in a Jewish way that will be different from the majority of people in Israel who speak in a Jewish way that is particularistic, ethnocentric, sometimes even anti-democratic way. Otherwise, there won't be any fight. I leave them the ground. And that's what the liberal secularists do in Israel. They are not relevant. They are more and more minority, and they are not relevant. Three main issues are at stake when we speak about the possibility of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. One is the question of the territories in the West Bank. Two is the questions of equality between Jews and Arabs within Israel. Three is the question of religion and state in Israel and the Jewish and the religious coercion. In all those three issues, because of the way the Jewish state is interpreted, we are less democratic. I don't say that we are not democratic at all, but we are less democratic. I'll say 1 minute on each issue. Of course, about each issue, I can speak for hours. The question of the West Bank. I'll start with the finals. I don't believe that in the near future there is any chance of seeing a solution to the question of Israel and Palestinians. And this doesn't have anything to do with the right wing. Of course, in the right wing leads, you won't have any solution. But if we are going to have another government, like a government now that will be a government of rightists, centrists, and leftists, or even if the one day will be a government, who knows, of center and left, the maximum that a government from center left can give to the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, will never be the minimum that they are willing to accept. Why? Because what Israel needs in questions of security, including having army along the Jordan River, which is a must question, to be or not to be, for the security of Israel. Who knows what will be in Jordan in the future? Maybe it will become a fundamentalist state. And then the border will start in Iran, through Iraq that is already part of Iran, and reach my house in Petah Tikva, or Netanya, or the road number 6, or the Ben Gurion airport. To be or not to be, like Maslow, we have, of course, we need the first thing we need to live. Then we can speak about liberal values. So I don't see any option of two-state solution in the near decade, who knows how much time. But even if there won't be a solution, doesn't mean that we can't do many important steps in the right direction that will ease the tension between Israelis and Palestinians. Steps that Netanyahu's government were never willing to do, including strengthening the Palestinian Authority and improvement the economic situation of Palestinians, and trying to move as much as we can outside from their lives. So there are some steps in the right way, even if we won't have a peace solution. This is one thing. The second thing, when we come to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Arab Israelis, we must have a new pact between the majority of Jews and the minority of Palestinian Israelis, Arab Israelis. And the new pact will have to be based both on liberties and liberal values and rights, but also, we are Jewish, both on commitments. What is happening today is that the left speaks all the time about equality of rights to these Arab citizens of Israel, and the right speak about equality of commitments. And there isn't equality of commitments between Jews and Arabs, as there isn't within Jews between Haredim and not Haredim. I speak in both languages. I speak in languages of commitment because I'm Jewish and because also I'm Republican. Republican, I mean in Republican tradition that comes from the political thought of republicanism, like Montesquieu, like Tocqueville, like Spinoza. I speak about the commitment to the state, to the community. So what I want to see is organizations where you'll see Haredim, secular Arabs working together for 2 years when they are 18, 19, 20, even a year and a half, and doing things together for the society. And at the same time, we'll have to change all our attitudes towards the Israeli Arabs. It's not only money. It's not only what they will be given in topics like education and what's happening in finding jobs, etc. It will have to start with dignity. And again, from Jewish tradition, Kvod Adam, human dignity, is a key issue. Chazal say, Gadol Kvod Abriot Shedoche Lo Ta'aseh Shebatorah. When there is questions of human dignity is more important than what you can't do, forbidden things in the Torah. In Israel, there are many good things, but Kvod Abriot is not one of them. You won't see Kvod Abriot when you drive in roads. People cut each other. You won't see Kvod Abriot when people write in the social networks. And we don't see Kvod Abriot towards Arab. I want that every Israeli Jew will learn Arabic. Not Haredi maybe, but others. You live in the Middle East. Respect the culture of the area. And when you learn the language, you also learn about great poets, great thinkers. There were so many Arab, Muslim thinkers who contributed so much during medieval times to Jewishness and to the world, to Judaism and the world. If you are true Jew, then you have to treat each person, regardless of gender, regardless of religion, regardless of race, as equal. This is the base. Chapter 1 in Genesis. So I believe that we can be more Jewish and more democratic and be more equal and more committed, both at the same time. When it comes to the third question of religion and state, I have to say very simply, according to the Jewish tradition, there should never be separation between religion and state. Separation between religion and state is evil. Why? Because you live the state without true religious values. It's against what the Prophet said, and against Chazal, and against the Torah itself, because there are social and political mitzvot in the Torah. But in Israel, we don't say that not having separation between religion and state means ideas, moral ideas, social ideas, bringing social justice, because we are taking things from Jewish heritage. No, when we speak in Israel about not having separation between religion and state, we refer to the force that is in the hands of the rabbinate. And the fact that we don't have civil marriages in Israel, which is a sin according to my point of view. We speak about those things that are not part of Judaism, that came from the Ottoman Empire. Chacham Bashi, you had the chief rabbinate with authority. That was in the Ottoman Empire. And later on, the British in the Mandate inherited it. And then it came to Israel. When you read the Bible, in the 10 Commandments, you have chief rabbinate. When the person came and wanted to be converted to Judaism, להתגייר to Hillel HaZaken, he asked, tell me all the Torah on one foot. He said, we should have a strong rabbinate. Said, מה ששנוא עליך, אל תעשה לחברך, ואידך זה לגמור. Don't do the other, what you don't want to do to yourself. Moral command. That later on even influenced Kant through medium ideas. When you look at Chazal, Look, when you speak about with Haredim, they'll say that the key issue is having huge yeshivot with hundreds of thousands of people who are living there and learning Torah and put themselves and they on the society, and the society have to pay for them. Where it is written in Judaism. When you learn Rambam, Hilchot Talmud Torah, chapter 3, he says that if somebody is putting himself on the society and they have to pay for his learning Torah, he is mechalel shem shamayim. If somebody wants to help you privately, the Rambam himself took money from his brother till he was killed, and then he helped the family of his brother, David. That's privately. Like I can take money privately from whoever wants. You see, it's important. Issachar Zvulun. According to Chazal, Issachar learned Torah. Zvulun gave him money. Very good. But that is voluntarily. But to put yourself, the Jewish keilot in Sfarad and in Ashkenaz, they took money by force in order that so many people will learn Torah all their lives? That's against Jewish heritage. גדול הנהנה מיגיע כפיו יותר מירא שמיים. If you enjoy what you work hard in your hands, it's more important than if you are afraid from God. So this key ideas that I learned, I was raised upon it when I learned in Hebron Yeshiva and in Kollel in Mir. That you keep all the world if you learn Torah all your life. And some of my best friends till today learn Torah. I don't speak about minority who will stay for many years and learn Torah. That's great. But to put yourself and make Israel a third world state, that will happen when you have 25% Haredim in the future. We will become a third world state. That's pikuach nefesh of the state of Israel and the kiyum hayadut. That's Haredim. And the religious Zionists say that the key issue is settlements in all around Israel, where it is written in the Torah. In one place, did the prophet speak about settlements in all the greater Israel? One place in the Bible? Chazal, during Yanai the king, Hashmonite king, they were against greater Israel in the Galilee and the Golan Heights. Why? Because you brought many people who are not Jews in. So they fought against the greater Israel, not for the greater Israel. And today, every settlement with 30 people, somewhere in the deep territories, there are places which are important strategically, okay, but in many, many places, and this is the key issue of Judaism. So the two greatest movements in Israel, religious life, the Haredim and the religious Zionists of today, that wasn't religious Zionism of 40 years ago, but religious Zionists of today, they speak very differently from the key texts in Jewish tradition. When I speak that, for instance, fighting against corruption is a key Jewish idea. You read Isaiah chapter 1. Everyone in the Haftarah reads it before Tisha B'Av. Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz. איכה הייתה לזונה קריה נאמנה, מלאיתים איש צדק ילין בה ואתה מרצחים, שרייך סוררים וחברי גנבים. Those issue of corruption is a key Jewish idea. You hear in Israel a rabbi speaking about it as a Jewish religious main idea. You hear of rabbis who speak in Israel in questions of beating women and selling women for sex purposes, and something that is against the dignity of man, that created in God's image. So not the secular speaks relevantly because they don't speak Jewishly, and those who speak on Jewish ideas always speak not on the key issues. Many times when I speak to people about these ideas, religious and secular, they ask me one question. Why I didn't hear about it before? I heard that other things are more important. If this will be religion in Israel, we can be much more religious and Jewish. If you are atheist, take it traditionally. If you are religious, take it religiously. If you keep rituals, keep it everyone according to his understanding. But I always tell atheists, secular atheists, most of the seculars are not atheists, but those who are atheists in Israel, and they are about 15%, I tell them, Judaism is yours. You don't believe in God? Okay, you don't believe in God. But the Jewish heritage is yours, it's not only mine. So they tell me it's not relevant for my life. I say, it's very relevant for your life, but you don't hear the relevant things. I believe that the majority of the seculars in Israel wants to feel more connected to Jewish heritage, but they won't go there as long as the rabbinate will be so strong and enforce obedience and anti-liberal. I say that every minute that the rabbinate has such a strong power in Israel makes few people anti-religious, even anti-Jewish. So my dream is, and I'm coming to the last word before we'll start speaking freely, that Israel will go to its main Jewish heritage. If you will speak in this language, and if Israel will be much more interested in human dignity as a Jewish and democratic idea, as a more Jewish and more democratic idea, and if Israel will be less bureaucratic and more democratic in the participatory understanding of it, more people will have more power in the periphery. This is very Jewish, like in the Judges' time. If Israel more federal, if Israel will be like that, it will be much more Jewish and much more democratic. And many Arabs told me that when we are against a Jewish state, is not the idea of a Jewish state, but is the understanding that a Jewish state means that I am a second-rate citizen. But if I say that because Israel is a Jewish state, you should be a first-rate citizen, everything is different. And the same about the clashes between the young people in Israel and the young people in America. If this gap will go on, it's very bad for American Jewry. Jewishness needs Israel and connection to Israel, but Israel needs the universalistic understanding of the Jews in America. So we both need to build together a pact between ourselves. Okay, thank you very much. This is the main ideas, and I open it for questions, debates. I see that in the chat there are some.
A number of comments and questions were raised on the chat, and well, you know, the time division was based on good intentions, but that doesn't always materialize. So let's start with a couple of questions that were raised, and maybe first with a comment. Rabbi Faust suggested that a good beginning would be the Declaration of Independence, which sort of made the selection that you were alluding to, talking about a Jewish state and stating that the Israel will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets, namely a focus on a particular selection or priority that I think you alluded to. Would you agree that that's a good starting point?
Okay, I think it's a very good starting point. If you go to the internet, to YouTube, and you'll put Moshe Hellinger, Darkenu, you'll see 2 minutes speaking of me against the new law of a nation in Israel.
The nation state law.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I said. We have to go back to the Declaration of Independence, which is both at the same time, very Jewish and for equality at the same time. So I was against this law, or at least if you want a law, then you have to put a passage about equality. So you can see my words about it. Certainly, I accept it. Yeah.
So Rabbi Plotkin was saying, I think something that's obvious, namely, you talk about Jewish language, but there are many Jewish languages. Now, he wrote that early on in your speech. I think that you have explained it later on. But that brings us to a question that Dr. Debbie Weissman posed, and you may know her. Debbie Weissman says, I've been active for many years in Oz V'Shalom and the Tivot Shalom and Meimad, and we spoke a Jewish language, but ended up being, marginal in Israeli society, in the Israeli religious society. You yourself pointed out that there aren't too many people who speak your way or who think your way. So she's asking, what do you suggest? How does one change that? And the question is really addressed to you as well. How do you move from a marginal, well-meaning revolutionary, so to speak, basing yourself on solid Jewish roots, to expanding that vision to a majority of Israelis?
Okay, so I'll answer both questions. About several languages, Jewish languages, I don't accept it. In order to see why, I don't believe in the idea that everything in Judaism is the same. There are key texts, key concepts, key crossroads. And when, for instance, Rabbi Akiva says that ואהבת לרעך כמוך is klal gadol b'Torah, it means that this is very important issue. When Hillel says, מה ששנוא עליך אל תעשה לחברך, that was before Rabbi Akiva, a main issue. When you look at the 10 commandments, and you see the majority of the commandments are moral commandments, not ritual commandments. Not that rituals are not important, but it's not the main issue. And even if you look at the Nevi'im, the prophets, they say that if you are doing rituals, but you don't have morality, what the purpose? So I brought Isaiah chapter 1. We read it always before Tisha B'Av. This is a key text. There are key texts and key ideas and the great junctures like Baal Shem Tov during the beginning of the Hasidut. He turned inward to the human being, humility before God, to equality between other people. So yes, I can see there is more important ideas and less important ideas. For me as an Orthodox, kashrut is very important, but many issues in kashrut are from Rabbanan, not from the Torah. I don't say it's not important. Lashon hara, saying bad things to other people, according to the halacha itself, is one of the worst sins. Is more than eating shrimp. So there are key issues and we forgot the basics. We have to go back to the basics. And again, about what Debbie asks, I am not left-wing today. If you are left-wing, it's very difficult to speak to the majority of Israelis. Today I am in the center, and I believe that at least 40% of Israelis are where I am. They want solution to the problem of Israelis, Jews, and Palestinians, and they don't believe it can be reached in the near future. They are skeptical. They don't believe in the immediacy of the two-state solution. They don't want the power of within the rabbinate. We know all the time that the majority of Israelis, including most of traditionalists and part of religious Zionists, are against this coercion. In many issues, when I give lectures to different audiences, and there are, let's say, about 150 people, and I speak with them for 2 hours, and later on I speak with many of them and they write me emails, they tell me always, we accept 90% of what you said, at least. So yes, there is an option for that. I'm working on it. I hope that this government will stay a long time. and I will try to raise a centrist movement that will be able to correspond to these ideas in the Israeli society. I am very optimistic that many Israelis basically agree with what I said here. They come from secular, from traditionalists, and some also from the religious, even some of Haredi. Okay, other questions, Uri?
Well, one question that was asked is sort of reflecting the difference between America and Israel. The question was, won't separation of religion and state solve these issues?
The answer is no, with a capital letter, no way. One, there's no chance of separation in Israel because the majority doesn't accept it, doesn't want separation. You should understand, separation, America is a very unique case. The separation of state, of church and state in America, that came from almost from the beginning, some of them only 100 years later, of the American federalism. But you go to the Constitution, to the amendment, the First Amendment. America is a secular state and a religious nation. Things that you can do in America when you speak about God, you can't do in Israel. I remember that when Vice President Al Gore came to Israel during the festival of 50 years of independence in 1998, and he was a religious person, deeply committed religious person from Democrat, not Republican, much more religious than Trump. For Trump, his God is himself. I always believe that he has like a temple for the God Trump. Anyway, when Al Gore came to Israel and he spoke about God and God, everybody in the secular said, why is doing it? Because of the religious parties in Israel? On the dollar you have in God we trust, that comes back to the Calvinist idea that was the base for Puritanism in America, that when you work hard, you trust in God. Later on it became that the dollar is the God, but that wasn't the original idea. In any case, in America, in many things you speak about religion. Every president, when he goes to war, he speaks about God and about the connection of the American people to God. The Bible is more important in America than in Israel. In Israel, you can't have separation of religion and state because this is post-Zionism. The only person who was serious about speaking about separation of religion from state in Israel wasn't Yeshayahu Leibovich, who didn't understand what he said, and I wrote 6 articles on Yeshayahu Leibovich. So I know his thought very good. It was Azmi Bashara, the founder of the Balad party, who is now outside Israel because he betrayed. And he helped the Hezbollah during the Second Lebanese War. Azmi Bashara said that the only way that an Arab citizen in Israel will feel that Israel is democracy is if it will have a separation of religion and state. That means that all the rituals in Israel won't be driven from the Jewish heritage, all the symbols of Israel won't be driven from the Jewish heritage, all the festivals and holidays won't be driven from the Jewish heritage. So there won't be a separation between religion and state. And I don't want a separation from religion and state because I want to take the key moral and social ideas from Jewish heritage. It's a huge heritage, unparalleled in all the world. And believe me, I know all the great civilizations. I read texts and ideas about about the Chinese civilization, the Japanese civilization, the Buddhist civilization. There isn't any parallel. So why not to take from our own heritage? It doesn't have anything to do whether you believe in God, don't believe in God, you are religious, you are traditionalist, you are secular. But I don't want the force that is within the rabbinate, which is unmoral. Unmoral. If somebody can be good enough to die in the state of Israel, for Israel, he can't be married in Israel. So not separation In America, you have two ideas. You have separation between church and state, and you have that the other idea is that the state won't be involved in what's happening in the churches. So I speak about this second idea, not the separation or what it's called the wall of separation, because this is anti-Jewish, but about these enforcement issues. And usually when people in Israel say that they are for separation of religion and state, they don't mean what they say. They are not anti-Zionists. They are very Zionists. They are not Azmi Bashara. Okay, so that for that question.
Well, I think that hearing you, and the irony, of course, is that in recent political negotiations, there were those who, I forget whether it was Netanyahu or someone else, who said the only religious person in this new emerging coalition is Mansour Abbas.
Yeah.
Because he represents the Muslim movement, the Muslim faction.
Brotherhood, yeah.
And the irony, of course, is that you mentioned Azmi Bashara, but what very few people realize is that the basic law, namely the constitutional law in the Palestinian Authority, is that Palestinian law will be anchored in the Sharia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting that with the mix of religion and politics, or religion and state in Israel, this is still sort of pales in comparison to what the Palestinian Authority is considering for its mixing of religion and politics, not mixing, but basically subjecting politics to Sharia law. But I think, yeah, okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I wanted to say, I believe, and I write a lot in the Facebook. If you want, you can look. I write many things. I have about 5,000 people, like friends. So it's in Hebrew, but you can also, of course, have the translation to English. So I write about all the issues. So, and I'm very committed. It's very important for me to speak. I have thousands and thousands of pupils and students and pupils all around Israel. So it's very important for me. Anyway, I wrote a post one day ago, and I said that when you speak about religion and politics, you must understand that religion and the combination of religion and politics can be very harmful, can be even disastrous, as we see in the radical Islam, but it can be very hopeful. It can bring a lot of tikkun, of amending the world. So the question is always the how. This is the key issue always, not the what, but the how. So the question is, what sort of combination between religion and politics? If it's for the force of institutions, very bad. If it's for having radical fighting, very bad. If it's for speaking in same heritage of the Abrahamic people and taking some good ideas from the Quran, some good ideas from the New Testament, some good ideas from the Tanakh, the Old Testament, you can do wonderful things. The question is always how you do it. So I believe that we went the wrong way in the combination between religion and state in Israel. And we should go the right way to the moral, the social, the great ideas that we have in our tradition. So the question is always the how. The how.
Well, it was important for me to bring you together with the very diverse group, professionally and politically and denomination-wise, etc., that has come together in these webinars. Because just as Chidush is unique and can be seen in the Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Kentes for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, a number of the board members and active members are on the call. Namely, it's the only rabbinic and cantorial network across denominational lines and across political lines that's committed to the notion of religious freedom and equality in Israel. Clearly, your vision represents a comparable approach that distinguishes, that does not separate between the different denominations. And as you mentioned, you are now working on a grassroots initiative and a movement that's going to be introducing those ideas to the Israeli public. And hopefully you'll agree. I think we have a lot to consider working together on, but your work is cut out for you. You yourself mentioned that the Haredi community in Israel today is not here, not where you are. The Zionist Orthodox are not there. The secular have their own challenges. So there is a lot at challenge here, but I think that hearing you and sharing your message with us has been very encouraging and I think inspiring perspective, because all of us are committed to Israel and all of us are concerned about that clash between these seemingly contradictory notions of Judaism and democracy, and you are offering a way that, as you described it, is both more Jewish and more democratic, and for that we are grateful to you. So we are looking forward to seeing your book come out in English, and we'll certainly be making everything possible to spread it around, spread the awareness of its existence around. Friends, please bear in mind, 2 weeks from now, we'll bring those lofty ideas and inspirational concepts to the ground in talking about what is the new government going to be doing in the area of religion and state, and how will it treat diaspora Jewry. Thank you, Professor Hellinger. We look forward to hearing more from you and reading your work, preferably in English. And shalom to you all. Thank you, and thanks to Ruach Hidush, to JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and to the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Shalom from Jerusalem, lehitraot in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye, lehitraot.
Bye.